The 3 decades following the Civil War are known as the Gilded Age, a name sarcastically bestowed upon it by famed author Mark Twain in the 1870s. The period was characterized by rampant corruption in government and police offices and economic institutions, as well as frequent political power changes and ethnic clashes.
The administration of the last president of the Reconstruction era, Ulysses S. Grant, is the one in which the Gilded Age is considered to have taken full effect. Still unnormed by war veterans, America welcomed Grant's acceptance of the Republican nomination for president in 1868.
Grant, however, was nowhere near the ideal candidate for president. As a general, he had no political experience whatsoever. The only time he had ever voted, in fact, was in 1856, for James Buchanan, a Democrat. He was notably ignorant and was never a good judge of character.
Nevertheless, by the election of 1868, Grant triumphed comfortably over Democratic New York Governor Horatio Seymour, with an electoral vote result of 214 to 80, though the popular vote was far closer, and is believed to have been tipped in Grant's favor by the black vote.
Riding the tide of his victory into the office of president, Grant did not, however, foresee the corruption that would plague not only his administration, but his entire country. Jim Fisk and Jay Gould paid off Grant's own brother-in-law while they carried out a plan to hoard treasury supplies of gold. Their plan, however, failed when the massive amounts of investments in government gold forced the treasury to release large quantities of it.
Was Grant involved in the scandal? Was he guilty? Was he crooked per se? No, at least not according to Congress. Wow.
Other forms of corruption during the Grant administration outside of politics, nevertheless, included the Tweed Ring and Boston Tweed scandal. This New Yorker used techniques such as bribery and fraudulent elections to make a profit of $200 million. His use of fear and money as weapons against honest citizens led the New York Times to gather enough evidence to use against him by the beginning of the 1870s.
Times cartoonist Thomas Nast used this information to attack Tweed through his works, despite the bribe sent his way in desperate attempts by Tweed to cover himself. The prosecution was represented by attorney Samuel Tilden, who helped out put Tweed in prison for the remainder of his life, helping the young attorney onto a future presidential run.
Corruption of the Gilded Age, of course, did not end there. Grant's in-laws are known to have benefited from the public payroll, though his reputation is known to have taken a much greater hit from the Crédit Mobilier scandal. Taking their salaries from money provided by stock investments, members of the Union Pacific Railroad formed a new company, Crédit Mobilier, in which they could pay themselves handsomely and take in large sums of money that were not theirs to begin with, so long as they could bribe the right members of both Congress and the cabinet.
Aware that Grant's reputation was deteriorating fast before the end of his first term, along with his permitting members of his own cabinet from escaping prosecution for involvement in the Whiskey Ring of 1874 to 1875, and the acceptance of bribes from suppliers to Native American reservations, moderate Republicans chose to create the Liberal Republican Party in time for the 1872 election.
The Liberal Republicans nominated Horace Greeley for the presidency in 1872, as the Republican Party kept tradition and again nominated Grant.
What might have come as a surprise to politicians in 1872 was the Democratic Party's decision to not field a candidate in the election and instead back Greeley for the presidency. And yet, even the united effort of the Democrats and Liberal Republicans could not overcome Grant, who won the election 286 to 66, resulting in the eventual dissolution of the Liberal Republican Party.
As Grant took office at the beginning of his second term, times quickly became harder for the average American, embodied in the economic collapse and panic of 1873. This collapse came as a result of a surplus in crops, rail lines, and manufactured goods and sunk mines. As a result, creditors lent loans that were never repaid.
Some offered return to the use of greenbacks, which had depreciated in value and had been effectively taken out of circulation after the Civil War. Creditors, on the other hand, did not approve, demanding that their loans not be paid in depreciated money. Grant sided with creditors and passed the Resumption Act of 1875, allowing the further removal of greenbacks from circulation, as well as vetoing legislation for the printing of more money.
As a result, the amount of money in circulation per capita decreased in the 1870s. Though it restored the government's credit rating, the so-called Republican hard money policy facilitated the election of a Democratic-controlled Congress in 1874.
With the arrival of 1876 came the impending election for president. Grant, who at first agreed to run a third time, was denied by his party, which instead fielded Rutherford B. Hayes, a relative unknown. The Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden. On election day, Tilden received 184 electoral votes, one short of victory, though he polled far higher than Hayes in the popular vote. However, with 20 electoral votes disputed, no victor was clear at the time.
An electoral commission was established to decide how the results would be determined, as returns from both the Democratic and Republican parties had been made available. Though the Republicans had the advantage in the commission, Democrats threatened to use a filibuster to keep a Republican from office. As a result, congressmen were left with no choice but to compromise.
The Compromise of 1877 allowed Republican returns to be read and used as the determining factor of the election, in exchange for the removal of remaining federal troops in the South from the era of military reconstruction and support for the subsidizing of the construction of a southern railroad.
Who benefited from the Compromise of 1877? Democrats and Republicans. Who didn't? Blacks, who were left at the mercy of Southern governments for the next century.
With the end of military reconstruction, Southern Redeemer governments, comprised mainly of the same Southern Democrats that had been in power before the Civil War, regained their power and began the process of returning the South to the system that had existed prior to its destruction. Redeemers enacted laws that limited the movement and action of blacks, including travel and employment, forcing them to work in fields as sharecroppers, not much unlike the system they had formerly been living in. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 had presumably granted members of all races equal accommodations in public places and prohibited most forms of racial discrimination.
Jim Crow laws, however, put in place for the purpose of segregation, kept blacks and whites apart from one another. These laws were upheld by the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the supposedly separate but equal institutions of the South were deemed constitutional. Thus, Southerners were given the green light to make their facilities everything but equal. In addition to such laws, the Grandfather Clause was put into effect to ensure that black men would remain disenfranchised by requiring that only one vote if his grandfather had the right to do so.
The blacks were not the only minority group to be discriminated against during the Gilded Age. During this period, a large number of Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States and accepted many of the lower-paying jobs commonly taken by Catholic immigrants from Europe, particularly Ireland. It should not come as a surprise, therefore, that the Irish were known to be among the most hostile toward Chinese arrivals.
By the election of 1880, Hayes had lost the favor of the Republican Party, and in his place, James A. Garfield was nominated. Garfield defeated Civil War veteran Winfield Scott Hancock by the electoral vote result of 214 to 155, though the popular vote was won by a margin of less than 40,000 votes. Not long after taking office, a deranged former office seeker by the name of Charles Guiteau shot Garfield in the back, causing his death weeks later.
Garfield's vice president and former running mate, Chester A. Arthur, subsequently became president, and under his administration, the Pendleton Act of 1883 was passed, which called for an end to required campaign contributions from federal employees and created the Civil Service Commission to appoint federal jobs on the basis of competitive examination.
In the election of 1884, rather than nominating Arthur for a full term as president in his own right, the Republican Party nominated James Blaine, Garfield's Secretary of State, for the presidency. Democrats, who had not held the presidency since 1869, nominated New York Governor Grover Cleveland.
The election campaign of 1884, however, was one of great mudslinging and little employment of real political ideas. Rather, Republicans used the fact that he had an illegitimate son against him and called the Democratic Party a party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. This gave Cleveland the edge he needed in rallying the Irish to his side, allowing him into office with the electoral result of 219 to 182.
Outspoken and hot-tempered, once in office, Cleveland was far too interested in furthering the interests of his own party and fired 40,000 Republican postmasters, drastically decreased the size of the civil service, and vetoed a bill to give seats to Texas, after having undergone a drought. However, he refused to give benefits to war deserters and others who were never served, or were attempting to swindle government money.
After studying the issue of the protective tariff throughout his presidency, Cleveland became interested in lowering the tariff in the interest of providing lower prices for buyers and less protection to monopolies. However, the recklessness with which he presented it to Congress left his party desperate in nominating him for a second term, and the Republicans rejoicing as they nominated Benjamin Harrison for the presidency.
On Election Day in 1888, Harrison defeated Cleveland by the electoral result 233 to 166, though Cleveland won the popular vote. As a result, Cleveland became the first president since Martin Van Buren, who interestingly lost to Benjamin Harris's grandfather, William Henry Harrison, to run for a second term and lose.
With Harrison in office, Republicans were delighted by their advantage in 1888. Speaker of the House, Reed, brought the House to bend to his will. Because the congressman, as a unit, held a total of $1 billion in federal funds, this term was known as the Billion-Dollar Congress.
The Billion-Dollar Congress did little for farmers as it passed a new tariff that only worsened conditions for them and forced them to buy high-priced American manufactured goods. In retaliation, the American public used the midterm elections of 1890 to shift the balance and elect a Democratic-controlled legislature with 235 Democrats in the House as opposed to 88 Republicans.
By 1892, the Populist Party, advocating change in areas considered part of government injustice, mainly constituting political reform, was growing in popularity, on its way to becoming among the most successful third parties to date. As populists gave blacks in the South, for their stark contrast in ideology from the traditional Southern Democrats, many Southern states actively used literacy tests to deny blacks the ballot, and would continue in desperate attempts to protect their control over their administration.
What we notice at this time is a growing discontent with typical politics of the time period. Andrew Carnegie's Homestead plant in Pittsburgh was the site of the Homestead Strike, during which enraged steelworkers fought back against pay cuts, only to have federal troops be called in to put down the violence.
In 1892, still riding the Democratic backlash against the Billion-Dollar Congress, and in spite of populist gains, Grover Cleveland was re-elected to the presidency after having lost to Harrison in 1888, becoming the only president to do so. However, as he began his second term, the Panic of 1893 surfaced and caused widespread disorder, unemployment, demands of precious metals, and the closure of thousands of businesses over the course of 4 years.
Democrats, including William Jennings Bryan, advocated the free circulation of silver. The gold reserve had dropped so substantially that Cleveland was desperate and turned to J.P. Morgan for a loan of $65 million worth of gold, where Morgan would receive a $7 million commission and one-half of the gold abroad.
For now, the economic crisis had reached a turning point.
Concessions have to be made before any dramatic change could occur.